Welcome to Public Health on Call, a podcast from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, where we bring evidence, experience, and perspective to make sense of today's leading health challenges. If you have questions or ideas for us, please send an email to publichealthquestion@jhu.edu. That's publichealthquestion@jhu.edu for future podcast episodes.
This is Lindsay Smith-Rogers. Today in our election series, what's at stake on the 2024 ballot for access to abortion? Joanne Rosen of the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health speaks to Dr. Josh Sharfstein about state ballot initiatives, the battle for state legislatures and Congress, and, of course, the U.S. presidential election. Let's listen.
Professor Joanne Rosen, thank you so much for joining me today in Public Health on Call. We're talking about the 2024 election and abortion. How are you?
I'm fine, and thank you for having me, Josh.
Now, I actually want to start our election podcast not at the federal level, but at the states, because I've been reading about all of these ballot initiatives happening in states around the country. What's at stake in those state elections for access to abortion care?
I'm glad you want to start with the states, and I want to anchor actually the election and the states and what's at stake back in the Dobbs decision from 2022, when the Supreme Court eradicated the right to abortion under the Constitution. They said really explicitly and more than once, they were now returning the issue of abortion to the people and their elected representatives. So they put it squarely back into the legislatures. And the overwhelming majority of abortion regulations are enacted at the state level, not at Congress. And there is, as you indicated, quite a lot going on at the state level. There are 10 states that will have abortion-related initiatives on their ballots. So when people go to the polls on November 5th, they will also be in those 10 states casting their vote directly on those abortion-related initiatives. One state, Nebraska, actually has two different initiatives on its ballot, one that would expand and protect abortion access and one that would restrict it. So there are very direct abortion access issues on 10 state ballots.
For the other states, not Nebraska, what are those ballot initiatives asking?
They are all initiatives that would protect or expand access to abortion, mostly through amending state constitutions. And interestingly, in those other states, there are a few states, such as Maryland or New York, in which the states already have pretty protective legislation in place for abortion. And those constitutional amendments would enshrine those protections in state constitutions and protect them from subsequent legislative restrictions. The other states, most of the states with abortion-related questions on the ballot, are states that have a lot of abortion restrictions, and these initiatives would expand abortion access in those states. So really consequential.
Would it be fair to say then across these states that by and large, it's the abortion opponents who are playing defense with state ballot initiatives?
Largely, yes. And just a point of background, about half the states in the country permit citizens to circulate a petition and get signatures to put questions on their ballots. These 10 states were not the only 10 that were attempting to get abortion-related questions on their ballot. There were several more, and they were hard fought and litigated in state courts. So this has been a battle already.
I've also read that in some states, there may be some attempts to interfere with the ballot process. Have you been tracking those?
There have been some efforts in state courts trying to throw out ballot measures on the basis that there weren't enough signatures or that the wording on the initiative is vague and doesn't comply with state requirements. And that's why at this point we have 10 ballot initiatives, not the larger number, for which there were sufficient signatures, but that were thrown out in state courts. There's another way in which the election has really profound implications at the state level. There are 44 states in which people will be voting for their state legislatures in this election. And there are, I believe, 11 states in which people will be choosing their governors. And since the vast majority of abortion regulation takes place at the state level, when you choose who will represent you at the state legislature or elect your governor, you are selecting the lawmakers who will be enacting laws either to protect or restrict abortion. And we've seen quite a lot of that activity in the 2+ years since Dobbs.
Let's switch to the federal level. And I think your point about legislatures is pretty important for the federal level too, because while there's a lot of focus on the presidential election, Congress is pretty consequential as well.
Yes, Congress is. Now, there is a narrower lane within which Congress can legislate with respect to abortion, but there is still a lane. There is a statute, a federal statute known as the Comstock Act, which I know we have discussed in the past. It goes back to 1873. It is an anti-vice, anti-obscenity statute that contains a provision that says it is a federal offense to use the mail or common carriers to transport any devices, medicines, articles, or other things that can be used to produce abortion. Now, the Comstock Act has never in its history been used as essentially a nationwide abortion ban, but there has been quite a lot of activity and many attempts in recent years to use the Comstock Act in precisely that way. It's a statute. It's not part of the Constitution. If there are enough members in Congress who would vote to repeal those portions of the Comstock Act, we could put an end to a lot of the attempts and discussion around wielding the Comstock Act as what would effectively be a nationwide ban on medication abortion, at least, but possibly all abortion.
What else could Congress do or pass that would be very relevant to access to abortion?
Well, as you probably know, there has been a lot of discussion in the recent presidential debate and more generally about whether there could be a statute nationwide that would ban abortion. And former President Trump was asked if there were a nationwide ban on abortion, would he sign it? That ban would be drafted as a piece of legislation in Congress. And Kamala Harris has said that if elected, she would restore Roe versus Wade, by which I think she means she would encourage and sign legislation that would reinstate the kind of protections on abortion access that we saw in Roe. So who you elect as president and who we have in both houses of Congress could have direct bearing on whether there's a nationwide abortion ban or a nationwide abortion protection. I should note, this is possible, but it is difficult to actually achieve. And I say that in part because of Congress's experience with the Women's Health Protection Act. That's a statute that would protect the right to abortion up until viability. It was first introduced in Congress in 2013. It's been introduced several times since, and it's always died in committee. It has not been enacted as law. So a nationwide law that would either protect or prohibit abortion is possible, but complex to get to.
A close election going one way or the other could put the U.S. in a very different position with respect to abortion access.
Oh, absolutely. Just because this is an unlikely scenario does not mean there are other ways in which who is elected as your representative in Congress and who the president is couldn't pretty dramatically change both the climate and the substance of laws around abortion.
So let's talk about what some people consider the main event, the race for president. The recent debate had a whole section on abortion. What can a president do other than sign laws from Congress that affects access to abortion?
One really important power that presidents have is the power to appoint federal judges at the Supreme Court and then at the lower level federal courts. And there was a lot of attention in the 2016 election where at that point, candidate Trump then said, if elected, I will appoint justices who will reverse Roe versus Wade. And that is precisely what he did. There are two ways in which there are vacancies on the Supreme Court. There are planned vacancies where a sitting justice elects to retire, and then there are unplanned vacancies where a sitting justice dies. We've seen both happen, and these vacancies have had really dramatic changes to the composition of the court. So a planned vacancy would be, for example, Justice Breyer's retirement, which opened a seat and allowed President Biden to appoint a nominee, in that case, Ketanji Brown Jackson. There was Justice Kennedy's retirement during Trump's presidency, and Trump got to fill that seat. And then there were the unexpected deaths of Justice Ginsburg and earlier Justice Scalia. And those vacancies really created opportunities for presidents to nominate their choice of justice. One piece of information that has been speculated about is that if former President Trump is elected, there are two of the current conservative justices, Justice Thomas, who is 76 years old right now, Justice Alito, who is 74 years old. There is speculation that one or possibly both could choose to retire, thereby allowing a Republican president to name their replacement, choosing someone who is several decades younger, and the current conservative supermajority of 6 justices would be secured for many, many years, if not decades. And then, of course, there's the possibility of an unplanned vacancy if a current justice takes ill or is unable to serve. And so one of the most potent powers that a president has is the power to nominate judges at all levels. And most disputes take place and are adjudicated not at the Supreme Court, but at the lower federal courts. There are many vacancies that arise in the normal course.
Yeah, so that also emphasizes the role of the Senate, which has to confirm the judges. So if there's a president and the Senate that are aligned, it may have a huge impact on the judiciary for years to come.
Absolutely. It takes us right back to your earlier question about Congress and the importance of Congress.
Let's talk about the other roles of an administration, what a president can do administratively, not through the courts, like you were talking. You mentioned the Comstock Act. Do you think that the presidential candidates might differ on how they could implement or approach the Comstock Act?
Absolutely. So the Comstock Act, from its inception, as I indicated, has never been understood either by Congress or by the courts, both before Roe versus Wade and subsequently. It's never been understood as an instrument to ban abortion nationwide. Shortly after the Dobbs opinion was released, the Biden administration was asked by the U.S. Postal Service, or the Department of Justice in the Biden administration was asked, can the Postal Service mail the medications that are used for medication abortion? Can they use the mails to mail the medication pills? Or would that violate the Comstock Act? And the Department of Justice's lawyers provided a legal memorandum setting out very clearly and based on their legal research that you can mail mifepristone or misoprostol, the abortion medications, without violating the Comstock Act, so long as the sender lacks the knowledge that the recipient will use the pills unlawfully. And since there are lawful reasons to use those medications across the country, for example, even in states with bans, there are exceptions that permit abortion in certain circumstances. So there was really clear legal guidance that the Comstock Act was not a nationwide abortion ban. A different president could revoke or rescind that guidance, could appoint a postmaster general and direct the postmaster general to enforce the Comstock Act strictly and aggressively. Or if there were a Democratic president, for example, if Kamala Harris were elected, the Department of Justice could stand by the earlier guidance. So there are administrative decisions that could really have an effect on how the Comstock Act is interpreted or not. Mifepristone and the approval of mifepristone was something that went through a federal agency.
Now we're getting to the FDA.
The FDA, precisely.
The Food and Drug Administration. And so I noticed in the Project 2025 document that, of course, has been controversial in the campaign, that there's quite an aggressive agenda for mifepristone and the FDA. Yes.
So mifepristone, medication abortions are the most common form of abortions in the country. In 2023, 63% of all abortions were medication abortions. Project 2025 so it is not the Republican policy platform. It is the product of the Heritage Foundation, which is an extremely conservative think tank. It's 922 pages long, Project 2025, and there's an extensive section dealing with abortion and reproductive health more generally. And one of the policy proposals is that the FDA's approval of mifepristone should be revoked. And that would take mifepristone off the market nationwide, and would essentially remove at least from lawful sources, the single most widely used form of abortion. But yes, one of the proposals that would dramatically restrict abortion access is the revocation of the FDA's approval of mifepristone.
If the FDA were directed to pull mifepristone off the market, that might be challenged in court, but then we'd be back talking to our discussion about judges.
Yes, there's a certain kind of tautology to all of the elements of regulation that we're running into here.
So between everything that's happening at the state level, the importance of state legislatures and the ballot initiatives, the importance of Congress and the presidential election, some people are saying abortion is on the ballot this November. Is that hyperbole?
No, I actually think that's a statement of fact. Abortion is very much on the ballot.
Thank you very much, Professor Rosen, for joining me today.
You're welcome.
Public Health on Call is a podcast from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, produced by Joshua Sharfstein, Lindsay Smith-Rogers, Stephanie Desmond, and Grace Fernandez-Ciceri. Audio production by J.B. Arbogast, Holly Cardinale, Spencer Greer, Matthew Martin, and Philip Porter, with support from Chip Hickey. Distribution by Nick Moran. Production management by Catherine Ricardo. Social media run by Grace Fernandez-Ciceri. Analytics by Eliza Rosen. If you have questions or ideas for us, please send us an email to publichealthquestion@jhu.edu. That's publichealthquestion@jhu.edu for future podcast episodes. Thank you for listening.